Hello everyone and welcome to our Essential Facts About Raw Food webinar and open house series. This is our third webinar in the series called Where Do You Get Your Calcium and Vitamin B12. We're really excited to share with you today some little known yet important information about calcium and vitamin B12 that could potentially make or break your success with raw food and can mean the difference between reaching your health goals or falling short of them. We want all of you to be as successful as possible, and we know that breaking down the hurdles of misinformation is an important piece of the puzzle to help you accomplish that. For those of you who don't know us yet, I'm Dr. Rick Dina, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Karen Dina in a few minutes. We're both chiropractic physicians with a strong interest in plant-based and raw food nutrition, as well as the functional medicine approach to health, board certified and licensed in the state of California. We're also the developers of the Science of Raw Food Nutrition series of classes that we taught for 10 years in person. We are the co-developers and instructors of the Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online and interactive course, which we'll share more about later on in this webinar. Now, from this and from speaking at many conferences and events over the years, we have become known for our thoroughness and scientific accuracy, our ability to make complex, confusing subjects easy to understand, and our encouraging approach that takes unnecessary hurdles out of people's way. You'll get just a little bit of a taste of each of those in today's webinar. We're also the hosts of the Raw for Life Summit 2016, the International Raw Food Summit 2017, and the Raw Food Mastery Summit 2018, as well as the authors of the Raw Food Nutrition Handbook. Before we go on, let me make sure that I say that the information and opinions expressed by us in this webinar are not intended to be used as medical advice and should not be used to diagnose or treat any medical condition or as a substitute for individual health care. This webinar is presented with the understanding that we are not liable for misconception, misuse, or adverse effects resulting from its use. Any type of dietary change, nutritional therapy, or fasting should always be undertaken with the supervision of a qualified healthcare practitioner. We may be those practitioners for you, but you won't obtain that just by watching this webinar. So moving on, in the webinar today, we will break through some misunderstandings about where important nutrients come from on a plant-based and raw food diet that can get in the way of people being successful in their quest for better health. Now, when Dr. Karen and I got started with raw food over 28 and 31 years ago, respectively, there were far fewer resources available than there are today. However, much of the information that we got back there was given from doctors and people who were very well educated about nutrition and had clinical experience and saw results, and they shared that information. Now, today, as we know, there's a lot more information than ever available before, but the thing is, anyone with a camera and an agenda sometimes can put information out there. And as a result of that, there is a lot of inaccurate information, misinformation, and conflicting information out there also. And that makes it so difficult for those of you seeking health to try to figure out how to best go about it. Collectively, I call this phenomenon the information age paradox, which once again means there's lots of information available, but compared to when we got started, a much smaller percentage of that information is now accurate. And it's going to get worse over time as the internet continues to expand. But when you have solid, reliable, accurate information, that cuts through all of the confusion out there, and you have a solid foundation in knowing how to implement the best in nutrition for your optimal health. We are committed to helping as many of you take the healthiest, most effective approach possible, supporting your pursuit of optimal health. I'll leave you with a quote from a former student of ours who took our Science of Raw Food Nutrition curriculum, which is the precursor to our expanded and updated Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online and interactive curriculum. Denise from Canada says there isn't a better course available designed to arm anyone desiring to improve the health of themselves and others, allowing them to weed through news reports, marketing, and research. Add on top of that a balanced, open approach presented in an inspiring yet modest manner. So feel free to let us know if you agree with this statement by the end of the webinar. Once again, we want to give you accurate information that you can truly use to make a difference in your life. We'd now like to share a little bit with you about what inspired us to start on this path in the first place. First, you'll hear from Dr. Karen, and then from myself.
I found raw food at a time when I was experiencing notable fatigue, for which there was apparently no answer. I was in college at the time and was sleeping 10, 12, and sometimes even more hours per night, and still waking up non-refreshed. I saw 3 medical professionals, and after multiple lab tests and evaluations, I had a diagnosis: fatigue of unknown origin. They had a whole list of everything I didn't have, but could not pinpoint the source of my fatigue. I asked every single one of them if my fatigue had anything to do with my college diet and lifestyle. They all emphatically said no. Things started to change, however, when a friend gave me a copy of a book that discussed vegan diets and the connection between diet and health. I also learned about the connections between diet and the environment and the way animals are treated. With all of these compelling arguments, I was open to giving this approach a try, and I became vegan. In addition to feeling good about eating compassionately and leaving a lighter footprint on the earth, I was so excited to find that my fatigue actually started to improve, despite what the so-called experts, in this case the medical professionals, said would happen. This personal experience opened the door to my thinking that diet really could make a difference in health and left me open to exploring other opportunities. Then when I learned about and implemented a raw food diet, my energy soared far beyond the impressive improvements I experienced by eating vegan. Now, in our 3-part video series, I shared the story of my introduction to raw food. Long story short, my fatigue vanished, along with a variety of other symptoms I'd had for years. And I had more energy than I knew what to do with. I could not remember a time when I felt better. I started to look healthier, I slept better, I enjoyed exercising, and my digestion improved. I was so inspired by the health results I was experiencing that I felt compelled to learn more about the inner workings of the human body, nutrition, and the diet-health connection. I really wanted to immerse myself in learning as much as I could, so I earned a second undergraduate degree in biology and received doctorate-level education in naturopathic medicine and chiropractic, which helped me to put everything I observed into perspective and on a much deeper level. Over the years, I've refined and revised my approach to raw food and tailored it to my individual needs, and we can show you how to do this too.
Now that you've heard from Dr. Karen, I'd like to share a little bit of my story with you. So here I was in 1986, not feeling my best. I was having a lot of allergy trouble in those days, which actually was a major part of most of my childhood. I have it in a way to thank because I felt so lousy, I was motivated to try to learn about some things to help be healthier. A few months after this, I started making major changes in my diet. And then fast forwarding to the spring of 1987, I went totally vegan with lots of raw foods included. So here I was in the summer of 1987. I'm the guy on the right here, and my brother was on the left, and you can tell his muscles are a bit more defined than mine. He had been at it for longer. but I was really starting to feel good. And I had been reading at the time that some people were saying, well, if you want to build muscle, you have to eat muscle. And if you only eat plant foods, you're going to wither away. Yet I was going to the gym regularly. My brother and I were about to go off on our landscaping job. That's why we were dressed that way. We had shirts on before the picture, though. And I was building muscle. My muscles were getting bigger. I was adding more weights to the machines, and it seemed to be working. So a few months into veganism at that point, and just a couple of months into working out pretty seriously. So moving forward to Thanksgiving of 1987, I ran in a 5-mile race in my town, well-known race, and I was giving it all I've got there, as the caption says. My mom just happened to get a picture of me near the finish line, really going for it. So that was a great race. I'll never forget. There I am with my brother at the end of the race, the muscular guy you saw next to me a few slides ago. And he was really into running also. And normally he would have been running in that race as well, except he had just finished a 7-day fast, and it wasn't appropriate for him to run yet. And so for us at the time, fasting was like the new frontier. You know, we started out with eating less fat and more fiber, and then moving to vegan and then raw. And then now we were all excited about fasting. And in fact, a few months after this photo was taken, I fasted on water only for 14 days, which among other benefits made a night and day improvement in my allergy issues. And I was absolutely delighted about that. So how did I do in the race? Well, let's take a look here. If you take a look at the bottom left, that might be a little bit hard to see. So let's bring a close up here. I ran this 5-mile race in 29 minutes and 7 seconds. So some of you who are runners might know out there, if you know, 8-minute mile pace for a 5-minute mile is number 600, you could probably guess better than I could how many people were in the race. But I'm going to guess 1,200 at least, maybe 1,500 or so people in the race. And I came in 37th. And I ran track in high school, but I wasn't especially good. But it seemed like all of a sudden I was, really up there with athletic performance. And looking back, I had been a vegan, mostly raw, for 6 months at that point. And I'm going to say that that was likely a major contributing factor. So here are the results of that race, which I mentioned. A couple other races that I'm proud of. In 1993, it was early in chiropractic school for me. I ran the Atlanta Half Marathon in a little under 1 hour and 27 minutes. So that's a 6 minutes and 38-second pace on average for 13 miles. In 1994, I ran my second 5K race. I had run one earlier where I did pretty well, but then I wanted to do better the next time. So I did some track workouts, and I ran that race in just over 17 minutes, which is a 5.5 minute mile pace for just over 3 miles. And I remember in that race, I came in 5th place, and there were like 600 or 800 runners in that race. So, I was thinking back to the people who were telling me that I wasn't going to get enough protein on this type of diet, it started to seem really silly by that point. So fast forwarding to 1999, my girlfriend at the time went to an amusement park, and this was some big giant pterodactyl on top of this truck at the top. And you can see there that I've got some pretty good muscle development. I was mostly running at the time, but I was going to the gym a couple of times a week, and I had been doing so for a year or so at that point, and was building muscle as a result. And then a few months later, I believe this was the summer of 1999, so 12 years into being a raw vegan. And unfortunately, I was sedentary more of that time than I was active, but every time I started to get active, give it a few months, and I seem to be doing really well. So Once again, people had been telling me for 12 or so years now that I wasn't going to be getting enough protein, and it seemed really silly, not just from my own experiences, but from meeting other people as well, and also studying the science behind it. So even though I was extremely convinced, and I'm just using protein as an example here, that I was getting enough of that, I knew that so much of the information people were spreading out there was inaccurate. And this is the type of thing, for example, that can keep people from going on a plant-based diet because they're concerned they're not getting enough protein, and then they go down a different path that may not serve them as well. And I know people who've actually had heart attacks and other things because of that particular misunderstanding. Now, unfortunately, there are lots of other misconceptions that have persisted over time. People get very concerned, not only about protein, but about where do you get your all sorts of other nutrients, vitamin B12 and D and K2, calcium, iron, selenium, zinc, omega-3s, and the list goes on. So to help alleviate some of these concerns, in this webinar, Dr. Karen is going to speak to you about a couple of key nutrients that are important to know about on any diet, which includes plant-based and raw food diets, and then I'll have some additional information to share about each of those from a clinician's perspective, in having analyzed the lab work of vegans and raw vegans I've worked with over the years, much like the format we utilized in our first webinar in this series on fructose and fat.
And now we'll discuss some eye-opening information about calcium and vitamin B12. Now, if you've been involved in the raw food, vegan, and plant-based community for any length of time, you've likely been asked the ever-popular, where do you get your types of questions? And we'll answer some of those questions for you here today. Now, what is calcium exactly? We know that it's an important nutrient, but more specifically, calcium is an element. Calcium is found over here on the left-hand side of the periodic table with the alkali metals and the alkaline earth metals, and those would include sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Now, in our class, Mastering Raw Food Nutrition, we talk about the fascinating research that's been done on the alkaline minerals and their activity in the body. So calcium is considered to be an alkaline mineral. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in the human body, with over 99% of it found in our bones and teeth, and the other 1% is found in our body tissues and blood. Now, even though only 1% is found in our tissues and blood, this 1% plays a very important role in muscle contraction and acid-alkaline balance. For example, every time you move a muscle, calcium is involved. In the bloodstream and elsewhere, calcium is involved in helping to maintain acid-alkaline balance. And as mentioned earlier, calcium is also a major structural mineral, making up a significant percentage of the mineral content of our bones. What is the daily value for calcium? As we can see up here on the slide, the daily value is 1,000 milligrams for women up to and including age 50, and men up to including age 70. And then 1,200 milligrams for women 51 and over and men over the age of 70. Now, there's a lot of confusion about calcium and what are actual good sources on a raw or plant-based diet. Leafy greens generally have a reputation as being good sources of calcium, and the two plant families that contain the greens richest in calcium are the cabbage family, which is also known as the so-called cruciferous vegetable family, and the sunflower family. Now, on this table, we have several members of the cabbage family, and as you can see, these leafy greens in the quantities shown are notable sources of calcium. And if we take a closer look here, we have 271 milligrams for 3 cups of chopped kale. And then for 3 cups of chopped bok choy, we have 220 milligrams. And then for 3 cups of chopped Napa cabbage, we have 180 milligrams of calcium. That's great. And then as you can see, there are other members of the cabbage family too that are good sources of calcium as well. One thing I like to mention is that broccoli has the reputation as being a great source of calcium, and it definitely is. But as you can see here on this table, there are other members of the cabbage family that are even stronger sources of calcium. This next table shows plants from the sunflower family, and as you can see, dandelion greens and romaine lettuce are notable sources of calcium when eaten in quantity. Now, it's not unusual for somebody on a raw food, plant-based diet to consume up to a head of romaine lettuce per day, or just a head of any type of lettuce. And as you can see, romaine lettuce, when eaten in quantity here, can be a significant source of calcium. Now, it's important to talk about the calcium content of foods, but the real question is, how useful or accessible to the human body is the calcium in those foods? The reason why I bring this up is because there are certain substances that we find in some foods that can bind to calcium and make it less usable by our body. Oxalic acid, also known as oxalate, is one of those substances. Oxalate binds to calcium and certain other minerals, including iron, making them less bioavailable to our body or less useful to our body. Oxalates are found in a number of foods, but certain foods are very high in oxalate, making them not very good sources of calcium. Examples would include spinach, rhubarb, Swiss chard, beet greens, and parsley. It's important to note that these are not bad foods. They're just not good sources of calcium, especially when they're raw. Now, many of these foods actually do have a lot of calcium, but most of that calcium is bound to oxalate and therefore not very usable by our body. And it's important to note that oxalate will not steal calcium or other minerals from your body. So that's really good to know. The reason I'm sharing this information with you is so that you can make more informed food choices. We've seen people in our clinical practice who have focused on spinach as being their main leafy green, and we encourage them to incorporate more of the lower oxalate greens into their diet to improve the availability of the iron, calcium, and other minerals. Here's a table showing the oxalic acid content of some foods that we just mentioned. And as you can see, parsley, chives, purslane, spinach, and beet greens are much higher in oxalic acid than the foods that are further down on the table. It's difficult to avoid oxalic acid altogether, but if we focus our diet on lower oxalate foods, less of our dietary calcium will be bound to oxalate and will therefore be more available for use by our body for important processes. Now, what about nuts and seeds? I included some of the more popular ones here, like sesame seeds, chia seeds, and almonds. As you can see, all three have notable amounts of calcium in them. I also included poppy seeds here because I found them to be a surprisingly good source of calcium. An important thing to mention here is that nuts and seeds, while they do have calcium, they also contain a substance or anti-nutrient called phytic acid, also known as phytate. Now, phytate binds to calcium, iron, magnesium, and zinc in the food that contains them, making these minerals less available for use in our body. Here's a slide showing the phytate content of certain foods. And as you can see, certain nuts, seeds, and grains are the highest in phytate when compared to the fruits and vegetables that are further down on the table. Now, just because these foods are higher in phytate does not mean that they're bad foods. It just means that they're not going to be our best sources of calcium. However, this is where soaking comes in. You've likely heard that soaking nuts and seeds can help to release enzyme inhibitors, which is absolutely true. Additionally, research has shown that soaking also inactivates phytate. In other words, when you soak your nuts and seeds, you can decrease the phytate content of those foods, allowing the calcium to be more available for use by the body. In this case, soaking has a dual purpose: breaking down of enzyme inhibitors for improved digestion and inactivation of phytate for increased calcium availability. Here's how it works. Soaking activates the enzyme Phytase in nuts, seeds, and grains, which breaks down phytate. Sprouting will also help to activate phytase. Soaking may also decrease phytate through the leaching of phytate into the water. In other words, not only does soaking inactivate phytate, it can also lead to the movement of phytate from the food into the water. In either case, more calcium is available for use by our body. The good news, though, is that phytate binds less tightly to calcium than to other minerals like iron and zinc, but nonetheless, soaking can make all of these minerals more available to our body. Now, you may be asking yourself, how much of a difference can soaking and sprouting make in phytate content? This table shows the results of a study that compared the difference in iron availability between unsoaked, soaked, and sprouted sorghum grain. Now, I know that grains are controversial, so I'm not suggesting that one eat sorghum grain or any other type of grain. I'm just using this example to illustrate the difference in iron availability. As you can see, soaking and sprouting certainly appeared to make a significant difference. And other available research mirrors these findings. So to summarize before we move forward, we have seen that soaking and sprouting can be beneficial for helping improve availability of minerals like calcium and iron by breaking down phytic acid. By contrast, oxalate is not affected by soaking and sprouting. And most high oxalate foods are leafy greens, which do not really lend themselves to soaking and sprouting anyway. So we suggest focusing on lower oxalate greens for calcium. What conversation about an important mineral would be complete without looking at a nutrient analysis? Now, it's very interesting to see the nutrient content of individual foods as we looked at earlier, but how much calcium do we find in foods when they're eaten together? Here we have an example of a medium-sized salad that has 4 cups of romaine lettuce, 2 cups of bok choy, 1 cup of grated cucumber, 1 cup of grated carrots, and 1 cup of chopped tomato. And we have a simple dressing with 1 tablespoon of soaked sesame seeds and 1 tablespoon of fresh squeezed lemon juice. All of these ingredients have a total of 368 milligrams of calcium. That's fantastic considering that this is a medium-sized salad. Here are the daily values for calcium for comparison. And as you can see, the salad provides a significant amount of the daily value for calcium. Here are some photos of the salad and dressing. And as you can see here, the salad is the size of a medium mixing bowl. Now for Dr. Rick and I, we would probably eat twice as much salad as you see here. But for somebody getting started with raw food, this might be a more reasonable portion. But I do have to say that the more calcium-rich foods that you add to your salad, the more the calcium is going to add up. The next nutrient that we are going to cover is the fascinating and somewhat controversial vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is known by the scientific name cobalamin, and it was given that name because of the cobalt atom in the center of the molecule. Now, vitamin B12 is essential because the body does not make it, and it's needed for important body functions, including the formation of every cell in our body, because it's involved in genetic code replication. And our genetic code is DNA and RNA. So, for example, when a cell divides to form a new cell, all of the DNA from that mother cell must be perfectly replicated for the daughter cell. And vitamin B12 plays an important role in this process. Vitamin B12 is also involved in the maintenance of the covering of nerve cells, also known as neurons, called the myelin sheath. Now, myelin helps with the propagation of nervous system signals through neurons, and in a vitamin B12 deficiency, that myelin can become disrupted, leading to neurologic symptoms that we'll talk about shortly. Vitamin B12 is also involved in serotonin production, and serotonin is a neurotransmitter or brain biochemical involved in creating the moods of happiness. Vitamin B12 also keeps homocysteine levels appropriately low. Now, homocysteine is related to heart disease, and vitamin B12 breaks it down, which is a good thing. Homocysteine is also a vitamin B12 test, which Dr. Rick will share more about shortly. Given all of the important activities of vitamin B12 in the body, it's not at all surprising that there are a number of deficiency signs and symptoms that one should really be aware of. I always tell people that it's best to get tested for B12 before any of these appear. It's also important to note that these signs and symptoms are not exclusive to B12 deficiency and may occur with other health challenges too. But if a few of these are present, it would be prudent to check one's B12 levels. Now, people with a vitamin B12 deficiency often have what's called a large red blood cell anemia, also known as megaloblastic anemia, which may lead to feeling fatigued. Now, when I was experiencing fatigue back in college, this was one of the tests that I was given, and as it turned out, my vitamin B12 status was fine, so my doctors moved on to other tests. Some of the other symptoms and signs people may experience with vitamin B12 deficiency are listed on this slide. For example, numbness and tingling and burning sensations in the hands and feet. That's called peripheral neuropathy. Now, sometimes, if these symptoms start to move up the arms and the legs toward the spine, one may end up with tremors or poor coordination. One would tend to get that in a very long-standing vitamin B12 deficiency. There are lots of other signs and symptoms that can come up too. In B12 deficiency, there may be decreased serotonin, which may lead to cognitive challenges and depression in some people. Elevated homocysteine levels in vitamin B12 deficiency may be contributory to cardiovascular disease because of its inflammatory properties. Now, I know that vitamin B12 is a huge topic of conversation in the raw food, vegan, and plant-based communities, but I like to mention that vitamin B12 deficiency is not just an issue for vegans, vegetarians, and raw foodists. And my classic example is the Framingham Offspring Study. This study was published in the year 2000, so this information is not new. It's been around for quite some time and is well understood. In this study, there were almost 3,000 people, and 39% of them were in the low normal or deficient range for vitamin B12. And what was fascinating about this study was that the study participants were not vegetarian, vegan, or raw foodists. They were all omnivores. They were all eating animal foods. Now, this surprises people because oftentimes animal foods are thought to be good sources or reliable sources of vitamin B12. But this study shows us otherwise. Vitamin B12 is a concern for everybody. I tend to be more concerned about vitamin B12 with meat eaters than with vegans because vegans tend to be well educated about vitamin B12. Now, what about food sources of vitamin B12? Very often, I'm asked about food sources of vitamin B12 and how reliable they are. People will often ask, are fermented foods a good source of B12? And what about seaweed? Can these foods have vitamin B12 in them? And the answer is that some fermented foods have B12, but not all. So fermented foods are not considered to be a reliable source of vitamin B12. Since vitamin B12 is made by certain types of bacteria, the fermentation mixture would have to contain this bacteria, which is not reliably the case, unfortunately. Most studies I've seen have shown that fermented foods are not a reliable source of vitamin B12, and the same is true for sea vegetables. Studies I've seen that were done on nori seaweed revealed that freshly harvested nori contains human bioactive vitamin B12, but once the nori is dried, the human bioactive B12 is converted into B12 analogs, which are molecules that look like vitamin B12 but don't have the same activity in the human body. Unfortunately, rehydrating the nori does not reactivate the vitamin B12. And this is likely where some of the confusion with vitamin B12 in sea vegetables come from. Now, what about the vitamin B12 that lives in our intestine? And the answer is that the bacteria that produce vitamin B12 can live in our large intestine, which is this green structure that I'm pointing to right here. Okay, so the bacteria that produces B12 can live in our large intestine. But the challenge is that vitamin B12 is absorbed in the last part of our small intestine. And our small intestine is represented here by this orange structure. So the last part of the small intestine is the distal ileum, and that is where vitamin B12 is absorbed. Now, unfortunately, the vitamin B12 that's made by the bacteria in our large intestine cannot move backwards into the small intestine because things only move one way in our intestines. And in addition to that, there is a valve between the large intestine and the small intestine that's called the ileocecal valve, and that valve prevents backflow. So unfortunately, what this means is that the vitamin B12 made in our large intestine does not move backwards into the small intestine. And in addition, vitamin B12 is not absorbed in our large intestine, only in the last part of our small intestine, once again called the distal ileum. So what is the most reliable source of vitamin B12? The answer is supplementation. If someone has trouble absorbing or is very deficient in vitamin B12, their doctor may have them get an injection. There are several different forms of vitamin B12 available in supplemental form, and here's a sampling. We have methylcobalamin, cyanocobalamin, and hydroxocobalamin. Hydroxocobalamin is the form of vitamin B12 that is made by bacteria in nature. It's not a human bioactive form of B12. So if someone eats a food that has hydroxocobalamin in it or takes a hydroxocobalamin supplement, the body takes the hydroxo portion of the molecule off and then replaces it with a methyl group, which essentially activates it, since methylcobalamin is a human bioactive form of vitamin B12. Now, cyanocobalamin is one of the most common supplemental forms of vitamin B12. It has a long shelf life, so supplement manufacturers like to make it because it can sit on a shelf for years and still work. When someone takes a cyanocobalamin supplement, their body will remove the cyano group and replace it with a methyl group to activate it. So both cyanocobalamin and hydroxocobalamin can be converted to a human bioactive form. And methylcobalamin is already human bioactive in the form that you get from supplements. So what form do we use? We use methylcobalamin, which we've been using for years and have experienced good results. One way to know if your vitamin B12 supplement is working or if you're getting enough from your diet is to get a B12 test, which Dr. Rick will explain next. So take it away, Dr. Rick.
Okay, so moving on to vitamin B12 testing. As you can see here on the screen, there are a variety of tests that we can utilize to see the B12 status in somebody's body. In fact, these are 4 tests that I like to utilize in my clinical and lab work consulting practice. So we're going to cover just the highlights of these just to kind of briefly take a look at some of the key aspects of each one of these tests and see how each one of these can come in handy in certain situations and how they might not be so handy in other situations. So for those of you who watched our webinar last month, our June 2018 webinar, we visited this test called the complete blood count, also known as a full blood count or a hemogram, depending on which country you are from. Now, in June, we took a look at how we can look at some of the complete blood count measurements to assess somebody's iron status. This time, we're going to take a look at how some of those numbers can assess potentially somebody's B12 status. So to reiterate and to have a little bit different version of what Dr. Karen told us a few minutes ago, we need vitamin B12 to convert folic acid into the usable form of folate. And Dr. Karen told us that folate is involved in the production of new cells. Now, in terms of our red blood cells that carry oxygen to every place in the body, so very, very important, then they pick up the carbon dioxide so our lungs can then breathe it out. Those cells need to get replaced regularly because every 4 months we have a whole new set of red blood cells. It's because there's a lot of them and they need to be replaced frequently. If you don't have enough B12, you potentially are going to not have enough activated folate. Therefore, you're going to inhibit your body's production of new cells. And because red blood cells need to be constantly produced, a decreased red blood cell count that can be measured on the complete blood count will show that the red blood cell count is low. So we can take a look at that on the full blood count. Now, what complicates matters a little bit here and makes things not quite so simple is that fruits and vegetables are high in folate. They have folate, not folic acid. Now, folate, of the total folate, a significant percentage of that folate is already in the activated form. So even if you don't have enough B12 to activate folic acid into the active form of folate, if you eat enough folate, you may have enough active folate in order to create new red blood cells, even without enough B12. So on the one hand, that's very positive because you don't end up with a low red blood cell count. You don't end up with anemia, even if you have B12 deficiency. So on the one hand, that sounds good, but on the other hand, Dr. Karen mentioned some of the other problems that can occur with B12 deficiency, such as depression or such as some very severe neurological deficits. And so if everything's going along and you feel fine and you're not anemic and you think everything's good, you don't have anemia there as an early warning sign. So you can get a certain false sense of security. And some of these neurological problems that can happen from long-standing B12 deficiency can actually be irreversible. And we have seen some very unfortunate case histories where this has actually occurred. So in any case, that's the basic deal with the complete blood count and B12 and folate and the red blood cell count. And by the way, this same issue of B12 and other things that activate folate versus consuming a lot of folate from food, which you get in fruits and vegetables, and a lot of that being in the active form, comes into play for some genetic testing called MTHFR, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. So say that 10 times fast. So that's a whole other story. So complete blood count, we've got that checked off. We can also take a look at serum B12, so we can measure B12 results directly. Now, some people are critical of the B12 test, and the bottom line for that is that B12 analogs, things like nori, like Dr. Karen mentioned, as well as spirulina and chlorella, can, if you're consuming significant quantities of those can make it look like you have more B12 than you actually do. But part of being a good clinician is taking a good history of whoever you're working with, and the majority of the people I work with are not consuming significant quantities of things like spirulina, chlorella, and nori that may potentially contain B12 analogs. So if you're not consuming B12 analogs, then serum B12 is a very good assessment of your B12 status because it's measuring that vitamin in your bloodstream directly. Now, the next two tests that we'll talk about, homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, they do not distinguish between adequate levels of B12 in your body or excessive levels of B12. Either way, each of those tests is going to look fine. Whereas with serum B12, you can see exactly what your level is. You can see if you're taking an excessive quantity. So anyway, there's a lot more to that, but just some assessments. Let's not rule out serum B12 because utilized properly, it can be a valuable test. So check off that we took a look at that. Now we get into some of the more kind of fun, advanced B12 tests. The first one we'll look at is known as homocysteine. And homocysteine is an amino acid that is pro-inflammatory to blood vessels at excessive levels. And there's many things that go into clogging up our blood vessels, but inflammation is a key major component in leading to various forms of vascular disease. Homocysteine creates inflammation, so we want homocysteine levels to be appropriately low. Now, the deal with homocysteine is that vitamins B12, B6, and folate, known as B9, are involved in breaking down homocysteine to keep the levels appropriately low. A few other things involved there, such as animal protein, but those are the major nutrients involved. So if homocysteine is elevated, any one of those three nutrients might be low, and that's causing homocysteine to increase. And you don't necessarily know which one that is. However, because I mostly work with vegans and raw vegans, and fruits and vegetables are, with the exception of B12, high in the other B vitamins, it's usually not B6 or folate. It's almost all the time B12. So in that regard, it's a good assessment of B12 status. Now, on the other hand, if homocysteine's low, you know that all three of those nutrients are solid. You know you're good in B12 and B6 and folate. So when homocysteine's low, it's just as valuable as any other test because you know your B12 is good. You also know that you don't have a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease, so you get some extra information along with your homocysteine results if they are analyzed properly. However, it doesn't distinguish if you have adequate amounts of B12 or excessive amounts of B12. Again, B12 itself will tell you that. So let's check off homocysteine. And then finally, we'll take a look at methylmalonic acid, also known as MMA. Now, what's good about methylmalonic acid is that poor B12 status elevates methylmalonic acid. Vitamin B12 is involved in the pathway that demethylates methylmalonic acid and turns it into something else. So because B12 is the only nutrient that affects methylmalonic acid, if it's elevated, you know for sure that your B12 status is not ideal and you need to do something about that. Unlike homocysteine, methylmalonic acid itself is not actually harmful. It's just an indicator. Now, you can measure methylmalonic acid in the blood or in the urine, and there are certain rare circumstances where the urine test might be more accurate than the blood test, but if those rare circumstances don't apply to you, both the blood test and the urine test are equally accurate. Similarly to if you are not consuming an excess of B12 analogs, then serum B12 is totally accurate in your circumstances. I know in various circles where people are not properly educated, they'll make statements like, serum B12 is not an accurate test. Methylmalonic acid is more accurate. Or the urine methylmalonic acid test is more accurate than the blood test. And what they don't tell you, and oftentimes what they don't know because they're just repeating rhetoric, is that that only applies under particular circumstances. And once again, if those circumstances don't apply to you, then their claims are irrelevant. Now, one of the things that is nice about methylmalonic acid is if your B12 status is decreasing and it's not so good, methylmalonic acid will start to get elevated before homocysteine will. So it's more sensitive when you're decreasing your vitamin B12 status. And if you are doing things such as taking a supplement to increase your vitamin B12, methylmalonic acid will start to decrease more quickly than homocysteine will. So when you're running out of B12 and when you're improving your B12 status, methylmalonic acid is the most sensitive indicator. But like homocysteine, it does not distinguish between adequate amounts of B12 and excessive amounts of B12 like serum B12 does. So let's check off methylmalonic acid there. So there is just a quick assessment of 4 ways that you can measure B12 status in the body. One measures B12 directly, the other 3 measure indirectly, but if you understand the mechanisms behind those tests, you can utilize them for your benefit. Once again, there's a lot more to the story for each one of those, but hopefully this has been useful. And to see a quick visual for that, in this webinar, in addition to the calcium content Dr. Karen covered, she and I looked at just a few highlights regarding B12. So we covered about this much, and in our curriculum, we cover an awful lot more about vitamin B12 and testing as well. And then if we look at the total amount of stuff that we've taken a look at in this webinar today, it's just a tiny, tiny sliver. In fact, the sliver is actually too big, but if we made it much smaller, you couldn't see it. Just a tiny sliver of what we have to offer you in our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition curriculum. So if knowing information like this to help you succeed with raw food and plant-based diets, to experience a higher level of health is important to you, then we have a solution. If raw food science explained to you in easy to understand terms in a fun format with plenty of time to sink in, a manageable time commitment, and plenty of opportunity to ask questions and get clarification directly from us is important to you, then we invite you to join us for our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition and Educator course. It's a 12-month class that begins on August 29th of 2018 coming up. The time commitment is about 2 to 3 hours per week. And what that 2 to 3 hours a week consists of is, number 1, professional quality videos similar to what you saw here in this webinar. And number 1, you can watch these videos whenever you want. They're available 24/7 in our membership site. We also break the 2 hours into generally 20 to 30 minute video segments. So you don't have to watch 2 hours all at once. You can watch 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, whatever the case may be. We've designed it to be as convenient as possible to work into people's modern lives. Now, another thing to consider is that 2 hours of these videos is often hundreds of hours worth of investigating and reading and learning and checking things out and figuring out what's most important out there and what's not so important. And then we hone that down into 2 hours to deliver it to you in a way that makes sense and that you can understand. I know sometimes people get confused when they say, oh, well, this course is 500 or 800 hours and yours is only 100. Well, the thing is, you can go read this stuff. That's what they tell you to do. Here, go read this stuff. I'm like, wow, that would be easy if we were administering a course like that. Go read this stuff and then take a test. Well, the thing is, we've done that reading for you. We've done that research. We've done that investigation. And there are certain things like our clinical experience that you can't read anywhere else, because how many raw food clinicians are there out there sharing their actual real-life clinical experience in a way that makes sense to people? So it's 2 hours worth of a lot of information really honed down so you can get so much out of just a very reasonable time commitment. So Before we offered this course, the precursor to this course was our Science of Raw Food Nutrition classes that we taught in person for 10 years. When we did that, we had a 12-hour 2-day course that started out the curriculum. And here's a couple of quotes from some students who took that 12-hour 2-day course. One of them said, "I've gotten more from these 2 days than I got in a year at and they didn't say the name, but the well-known nutrition program. I'm looking forward to the next segment." Another student said the sheer quantity and quality of information packed into 2 days by extremely knowledgeable and professional presenters was outstanding. So in our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online course, we have a couple of quotes here. Anne-Marie from Paris said, "I love my weekly videos," and you can see some of the video thumbnails popping up here of the different topics that we cover, just a little sampling of them. And Cynthia from Southern California said, "The course content is awesome." And as you'll see later, Cynthia had an extensive background in raw food nutrition before taking this course, and actually Anne-Marie had a pretty solid background as well. So in addition to these finely honed, very informative videos, we also have notebooks that go along with the videos designed to complement them. We actually send you 4 notebooks over the course of the year, and it's over 900 pages worth of notes. And also included in there are the thousands of scientific references that we utilized to put our curriculum together. So if there's anything you want to go look up directly for yourself, you've got the information in order to do that. So the reason I say that these notebooks are designed to complement the videos is because in a lot of courses that we've seen before, online courses, what they do is they take sort of the easy way out for notes, and they just get some software that listens to the video and then makes a transcript of things in paragraph form. Now, if we did that, that sure would have been a lot easier for us. But what we did instead is we really thought things through. And we thought, okay, how would we want it to be in the notebook here if we had the notebook open when we were following along with the videos? And how would we want it if we just opened it up and wanted to look at things? So we've got bullet points, we've got the charts and graphs that you see up on the videos in the notebooks. And that way, when you're watching the videos, you don't have to go crazy trying to write down everything we said, because the majority of that is in your notebooks. That allows you to pay attention to what you're seeing on the screen and be able to watch everything and be able to listen to everything, knowing that it's in the notebooks also, and it really allows it to sink in. So they are a great complement to the learning process. Now, some students still like to, take extra notes and fill things in, and that's fine. And because this is a video that you're watching, you can hit pause, you can go back, you can listen again. So it's very, very thorough. And another nice part of these notebooks is that they are lifetime reference material. So at any time in the future, you've got your notebooks there to go quickly take a look at to refresh your memory about something that you are interested in. And our students just absolutely love the notebooks. That's what they've told us directly, as well as when we have sent out surveys. So in addition to that, 6 to 8 times per month, we have conference calls. So those are on Tuesdays, and there's 2 different times to accommodate different schedules as well as different time zones, because we have students from all over the world. So they allow you to ask us questions and interact with us directly. So one of the ways you can do that is you can either call in on the phone, as it shows here, or access it through your computer. And you can either raise your hand and ask us questions directly, and we're in real time there. Or another option is that every Monday before we have the Tuesday calls, we send all of our students out an email. And that email has the call-in information as well as the URL computer links to access the calls. If you click on those links prior to the call, You can type in your questions in advance. Then we will see those questions when we're on the call, answer them to the best of our ability, and then we save and record all of the calls. So if you're able to not make a call, maybe occasionally, or maybe even one call doesn't fit into your schedule at all, you can still get direct interaction with us as part of the course by submitting your questions in advance and then listening to the calls afterwards. Instead of just giving you some reading material and telling you to take the test, or maybe just showing up once a month or something like that, we are there many times per month, almost weekly. We take the last Tuesday of each month off, but other than that, we're there every Tuesday to make sure that you can interact with us and get any clarification and make sure that this all really makes sense to you. And we love answering questions. It's just, we look forward to Tuesdays now very much to interact with our students. In addition to that, we have a Facebook group for our students, and it's optional. Not all of our students do it, but most of them take advantage of that. So first of all, it's a great way for our students to get to know each other. They're also very helpful to support the conference calls. So oftentimes a student will ask a really good question during the conference call, and we'll share some information, again, answer things to the best of our ability. And then oftentimes we'll think, you know what, we've got a chart or an article or something else, either that we've got on our computer or that we've seen online, and we don't have the time to submit that right then because we're on the call. But once the call is over, we'll oftentimes add some extra things into the Facebook group that you can go look and we'll tag your name on there. So it's very helpful in support of the calls, as well as just to have a general sense of community. So a few other things to mention about the structuring of the class. So exposure versus cohesion. On the one hand, there are two of us, and Dr. Karen and I, for roughly the first 15 years on our raw food and plant-based paths, that was largely independent of each other. And for the last roughly 15 years or so, that has been together. And so on the one hand, we have a broad perspective. There's two of us, and we look at things a little bit differently. But on the other hand, we are a married couple, and we love this stuff. This is what we talk about when we go out on walks and when we're driving and those types of things. And we are able to use both of us to integrate everything together so it all falls into place and it all makes a lot of sense. The previous incarnation of Mastering Raw Food Nutrition was known as the Science of Raw Food Nutrition that we taught in person for 10 years. Piles and piles of rave reviews from that, and oftentimes there was not enough time to answer questions and to have discussion. The way we've got it set up now online is for every 2 hours or so worth of content, there's an hour typically, and sometimes those calls go quite a bit longer. We just stay till we answer all the questions. There's roughly an hour worth of time in small groups for students to ask us questions. So there's more than enough time, and a lot more than we had to interact with us directly. May sound ironic, but much more time to interact with us directly than our students got when we taught this class in person. The other thing we've noticed is that the questions that our online students ask us are a lot more in depth, and they show that our students understand the material much better than our in-person students did. And again, that's because you're not bombarded with 7 hours a day worth of information day after day after day after day. You get 2 hours a week, you watch it again, you get to think about it, you get to talk to us about it, and everything sinks in at a much deeper level. So we've been actually absolutely delighted about how things have been going. And we're a little over halfway. We're getting near the last quarter of our second year of having this class online. And of course, going into our third year, starting late August. And it's basically been working out really, really well. We're very happy with it from an educator's perspective. Now, speaking of education, Many of our students go on to incorporate the information learned in our course into their raw food coaching practice, into their other types of educational endeavors. Some people decide to take that up once they've learned all the good information from our class, but many of our students just want the information for themselves to help lead the healthiest lives possible. And even when that's the case, oftentimes, whether you want to be or not, you become an educator, because people see how you eat once you start eating differently, and they start asking you, oh my God, can you get enough protein? And what about calcium and iron and B12 and essential fatty acids? And doesn't fructose all turn into fat? And, on and on and on. And so we teach you in the course, especially once we get near the end of the course, we teach you how to integrate all the information together and to share that with other people in a way that creates rapport instead of conflict. Because when you're confident in what you're doing that's different than everybody else, you're much less likely to be stressed about it. And that, of course, is a really important part of health. The other benefit is that you'll be so much less likely to be led off track. No one will be able to knock you down with misinformation. You guys know, Dr. Karen and I, we know the science, and we know our own personal data, and we know the data from many, many people that we've worked with. So in fact, not only would I not be deterred if I were in the mood to, depending on the situation, put on my diplomacy hat, I could very much turn that around to a learning experience for that person and a confidence builder for me. In fact, we got an email a little over a year ago from one of our first year Mastering Raw Food Nutrition students. Just out of the blue, this email shows up and the subject line was sharing a great experience. And here's what she said. She said, Doctors Rick and Karen, I had the most amazing experience yesterday evening and today. I'm in Monaco on business and I had meetings with 4 business people. It started out yesterday evening as I started my diatribe about nutrition. I started in reaction to a comment over dinner from one woman who referred to the fact that her husband ate lots of eggs and meat because he is a bodybuilder. A couple irrelevant things in there. And then she said, then I went on about how the body only needs the daily requirement of protein and the balance will be converted to energy via glucose or stored as fat, and how the fat is also used for energy. Then I turned to the balance between omega-3s and 6s and the inflammatory effects of omega-6s. Then I moved on to cholesterol and why we do not need it and how our liver produces it in the production of bile, being clear on how it is needed to emulsify fat, even the fats we get from eating vegetables, with a special comment about the omega-3s in leafy greens. The next morning at another meeting, they wanted more. And after explaining in some detail how the wrong mix of fat makes the structure of cells stiff and rigid, resulting in resistance for hormones, insulin, and serotonin, and the further consequences of each of those, and how too many omega-6s cause inflammation in our bodies, resulting in various disease processes. She says, I went on to calorie optimization overall and why overeating is bad, having too many free radicals and not enough antioxidants is bad, and why a meat and egg diet is deficient in vitamins, phytonutrients, and fiber. We talked about satiety, and I shared how excess weight can cause dysfunctions in the hormones controlling satiety. I was on a roll and everyone in the meeting listened with pure fascination. I must admit I was also listening to myself with pure fascination. They were all just like I was before I started the course. They didn't know even the fundamentals of nutrition. How is it possible that so many well-educated people know so little about nutrition? Knowledge is power, and I felt totally empowered today. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I have never been as interested in any learning experience in my entire life, and I am simply bursting with enthusiasm and passion. You have changed my life forever. So there's one example where a student realized how much she had learned from the course in a real life experience, and instead of being the weirdo eating her salad off to the side, she took a leadership role in that interaction and had a good influence on other people also. So those are the types of things that can come about when you are really well educated about any subject, in this case about nutrition. We mentioned Anne-Marie from Paris before, who said she loved her weekly videos. Her official testimonial for the class says, "I find it very helpful to have the point of view of doctors who are really impartial in their opinions and who explain things with scientific studies and fact, not philosophic thoughts, and who do not sell anything. I feel very lucky to be able to ask any questions each week and always receive a good response. I've learned a lot. I understand much more now, even though I studied biology and have read a lot of books about raw food nutrition." She said since then, but the real translation was prior to the class starting. She says, "I hope there will be a second year for us to enter even deeper into the science of raw food. Thanks to you, Karen and Rick Dina." So when we hear that an enthusiastic student wants even more of what we have to offer, that makes us feel good that we're on the right track. Cynthia, who you heard from earlier from Southern California, said, "I've been practicing a raw food lifestyle since 1998 when I did an internship at the Tree of Life with Dr. Gabriel Cousins. I really appreciate Dr. Rick and Karen's scientific approach to the subject of raw food nutrition and have appreciated learning the scientific basis of why this way of living is so beneficial." And one of the reasons that science is so important to Cynthia is because she is a real world scientist. She's a wildlife biologist that goes out in the field, and for weeks and sometimes months at a time, she camps in a tent and makes scientific observations. And so she knows the value of that, and she really appreciated that from our course. Now, if you don't have a background in biology and science like Anne-Marie and Cynthia, don't worry, we make it understandable for you. Here are a couple quotes from our previous Science of Raw Food Nutrition students. One said, "Thank you for your extreme efforts to reach the non-nerds. You were very organized, and I never worried that I would not have my questions answered. This was very professional and respectful of all levels of previous knowledge." Another student said, "The real strength of this course is the willingness of both presenters to engage students and respond to questions. Keep it up." And like I said, we love our Tuesdays where we get to interact and engage with our students and talk about raw food nutrition, our favorite topic. A couple of other quotes from our actual Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online students. So Monica from Southern California said, "I have taken many classes," and she means in plant-based and raw food nutrition. She said, "This was the most responsibly taught with high quality current content. It is one of the best classes I have ever taken." And Natalia in the beautiful Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico said, "This course gives you the knowledge and tools to be educated about plant-based and raw food nutrition. It's based on scientific researchers, awesome teachers. Thanks, Dr. Karen and Rick, for this exceptional course. It is so worth it." And this is just a small sampling of the testimonials we've received over the years from our curriculum. So in other words, there's lots and lots more where those came from, but we're going to keep things moving here in order to wrap up. So bottom line here to summarize is that you get 2 hours of professionally made videos per week. You get 900 pages and 4 notebooks thoughtfully designed to complement the videos and be lifetime reference material so information can sink in more easily. We have those 6 to 8 times per month conference calls where you can interact with us either directly or with a little bit of time delay, but it's still direct one-on-one interaction with us. If you ask a question, we answer it, then you'll listen to the call afterwards. We also have a Facebook group added as extra support. all of this is designed to give you the experience where you can learn the information and get the inspiration and the confidence to follow through on it for a lifetime of supercharged health.
Remember earlier when I told you my story about my decision to try raw food when I was in an energy pit of fatigue? Well, now it's time for you to make a decision. You're watching this webinar because you're interested in plant-based and raw food nutrition and in taking your knowledge to the next level so you can supercharge your health and maintain it for a lifetime. At this point, you already know if you want to learn more from us. This class will only be offered once this year, and once it fills, it won't be offered again until summer of 2019 and likely at a higher price. Right now, we're offering this course at a special early bird price for a limited time. As you've heard, our students are so happy with the new online format, and we've noticed a difference too. You can watch the course videos on your own schedule and rewatch them as many times as you would like. This way, you'll have plenty of time for the information to sink in. In addition, you'll receive the support of a comprehensive set of notes and near-weekly question and answer sessions in real time in small groups directly with us. We love connecting with our students, and we'll be there with you the whole way. You can access this course anywhere you have an internet connection, which is most places on this planet. On this webinar page, you'll find a link where you can click and sign up for a time to speak with us to answer any questions you may have about our curriculum, the structure of the class, and to help determine if it's a good fit for you. We invite you to sign up for a time to speak with us about your health goals and how mastering raw food nutrition can help you reach them. We look forward to speaking with you soon.